Let's see. Got it. Can everybody on Zoom hear us? Thumbs up.
Yes.
Okay, super. Sorry about the delay. We've been trying to figure out a way to get you folks on Zoom to see the PowerPoint, and we're struggling with that. So you may just listen. Be the PowerPoint later. Actually, I already have it, and I'll send it to you. Okay.
Very good.
All right. This is the third in our series. I'll let Rob take it from here.
Hey guys. Yeah, I think I recognize some of you. All right. So yeah. So next slide. So actually, I mean, you should know that what we did. Sorry, I got to be in front of this thing. So those of you.
I'm going to see if I can start from scratch and see if it makes any difference resetting this.
To look at the last.
I can't mute us.
To the climate days, and this you can do to be a part of the climate challenge. So yeah, next slide, I think. Yeah, there we go. Can you guys see this, right? So if you, I think John is sending you guys you did. Looking at this point is, sort of the question, what's the case for action at the state level? And I think all of you were with us last week, those of you on Zoom, some of you here as well. This is an example of where that old ad effective. Truth is, trying to do this at the global level, I gotta stay behind the microphone. I like to wander when I talk. That's what I normally do. Here we go. When I talk. So if you guys don't end up seeing me on the, can you still hear me? Those of you on Zoom? Nancy.
Now I can hear you.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Well, I'll keep trying, but I'll stay here so you can at least see me. Don't pretend like my thing here.
You're really breaking up.
Yeah, I thought so. I don't think the internet connection's tough, but so we talked about this last week. So the efforts to really address this at global scale are very, very little that seems to be accomplished. You end up feeling often very futile. Really very few results. Gridlock in Congress. If you were paying attention to the news today, you heard that there is again a conference that is of senators and a climate package. We've approached that multiple times. I have no hope. I got the email alert today from Climate Solutions saying that they're having conversations again, but it's the same email that they sent out about 2 weeks ago. So it's like, what can we expect? And the problem, of course, is we need to do this with speed and scale. So the title is the author of this book we mentioned last week. New book, relatively new book by he's an entrepreneur. He's a venture capitalist. John Doerr is his last name, Doerr. He gave Stanford $1.1 billion today, he and his wife, and triggered a bunch of other donations for climate research. I was a little disappointed in reading the full article that the newly appointed dean of this new John and Ann Doerr School of whatever it is, essentially said, we won't do politics. We won't do advocacy. We're only going to do education. Well, we may be at the point where we need to do politics while we're doing education. Because again, you can see on the slide. So this is data from Climate Solutions, actually. So if we're going to achieve the kinds of transitions necessary to address this problem, that is to get to zero by 2050, which is what many people say is necessary now, and to achieve a certain level by 2030, which really seems we will not achieve. I mean, you can see the list. So the power sector has to increase its transition by 4 times its current speed. Electric vehicle transition 2 times. That's probably achievable. That's picking up pretty quickly. Energy efficiency 3 times the speed with which we're doing it. So building efficiency. I mentioned last week the state of Washington passed a new building code that really moves that state forward very quickly in that regard. So that's good news. Zero carbon steel production. That is right. 10,000 times faster than it is currently moving in terms of decarbonizing. One of the reasons for that, of course, is because that's such a that's an energy intense productive activity. But there are ways to achieve that. It's all technologically feasible. Even that is technologically feasible these days. People like Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who I'm sure is going to get a big pay boost with that $1.1 billion gift just to Stanford. He's an important part of that project. To get there, we've got a lot to do, right? So it feels like it's almost impossible to do. What that means is, for change to really happen, it has to start happening at the grassroots. People have to be working at the local level, the municipal level, the state, to make those changes. And as those changes happen, things will develop. So I guess, yeah, the next slide, right? I think it's, well, you're on the slide. You're on the one I want. Good. What difference does it make if we respond out of Christian conviction? I say this: people really have to be careful about this when we do this. Avoiding the Riley Amendment 1 mistake. So famous governor of Alabama, Riley, who preceded the current governor, whose name is Alice. I can't remember her last name. He famously, as a conservative Republican, decided that Alabama had to overcome its tax problems and provide adequate funding for schools and healthcare. And he framed that as a Christian obligation. The backlash it went down 68% to 2%. So that's what I always call the Riley Amendment 1 mistake. You cannot, politically, it's impossible to turn this into a Christian obligation. We can act out of Christian conviction. We cannot, we can't impose, nor can we bring to the conversation the idea that there's somehow an obligation from a Christian perspective to deal with this. It's not going to work. It doesn't gain traction with audiences. So avoid that. It's always, it's clearly a mistake that needs to be avoided.
We can talk to each other in that language.
Yeah, we can talk to each other in that language. And even then, I think we've got to, we always have to be careful about what that language can produce. And we'll come to that. And I think sort of the starting point for us is to really rethink how we understand ourselves in relationship to nature, and recognize, people use the term these days, we're in the Anthropocene. That is, we're living in an age when we refer to geologic ages. Now we're living in an age when we are the ones who are shaping the planet. We're the ones who are making it do what it does. And there's no going back. Now we have to figure out how to act in ways that are appropriate. So when I say on the slide, leaving behind Genesis 1:28, which is the old, humans have dominion over nature, and recognize that in fact, there's this long biblical tradition as well of God using nature to punish us, which is a reminder that we're not the ones in charge, right? Nature is in God's hands. God knows how to use nature to bring us into line. But there is also then Psalm 8, we won't take time to read it right now, but that's representative of that tradition as well, that sees us as a part of nature, integrated into nature, and part of the awe of it, and human beings who stand in awe of it. So if we begin to rethink our relationship to nature, I think that's one of the things that we can bring to this as Christian believers. And then the bottom line for me is always never forgetting, as I say, who we are and who God made us to be. Born as sinners, made new in the water of baptism, set free. And as a consequence, when we do these things, when we engage in this kind of activity, this is a saving grace for me. There are plenty of days when I think there is simply no hope. There's just there, as much as I may want to do something, it's not going to produce results. But I'm able to sort of keep on moving because I live with the promise that I've been redeemed, I've been set free. You've been redeemed, you've been set free. We live as that people who have been set free to a new life. And we also know that God's intention for the cosmos is, as much as we may be in charge of it now, making a mess of it, and now charged with the responsibility of trying to clean it up. In the end, it's God who will manage this thing. And that's free, because then, you're allowed to do what you do and know that it may not produce the results that you hope, but you will have done what you have done in the sight of God. And you know that it's ultimately in God's hands. So I think that's, one way to sort of set the tone for this way of thinking about the effort itself that is, again, as I say, liberating. When I'm on the Metro Climate Action Team, I'm on a subcommittee, I mentioned this to the group last week, on transportation. And I have some colleagues on that committee who are so deeply, not just engaged, but their identity, their purpose, their being is tied up with success. And it's hard. It is really hard for those people because there's not a lot of success. There's not a lot of, results. And it shows. And every once in a while try and argue for a different way of seeing it. And Christian conviction about who I am and what the cosmos is in God's hands. So next, yep, you are ahead of me, good. So the importance of social tipping points. This gets a little technical, but these are helpful concepts for us. The reality is, even at the state level, even at the city level, West Lynn, trying to encourage West Lynn in terms of, I've started to get interested in some of the city government plans in terms of how we organize particularly new sites of commerce. It was astounding to me to start reading the zoning laws that are impediments to getting this done, and how that, so it begins to feel too big and too complex a problem, right? And our efforts are too little to make any kind of difference. What we know, though, about social tipping points is it's really kind of interesting. A point, as it says, become then a certain idea, a belief, a behavior, a social norm, a social structure, or even a technology like electric cars, for instance, spreads from a minor tendency to a major practice. We know that actually happens when you get, it depends on which sociologist you ask about this, but it can happen with 10 to 15% of the population finally making a move. So tipping points can come very quickly. And it doesn't take a lot. You don't have to convince 51% of the population for it to happen. It can come very early in the process. So social tipping interventions, those are the things we do to trigger a social tipping point. Social tipping elements are those kinds of social and economic activities that constitute the targets of a social tipping intervention. Let's look at a few of those. So next slide, yep. So a social tipping point we aim to trigger is this famous phrase, upward scaling tipping cascades to meet the climate goals. In other words, people argue that people who are thinking about this strategically think you have to push at a whole bunch of different levers or trigger points all at once. So you need to push at electric, you need to push at building efficiency, you need to push at conversion of energy production, conversion of manufacturing processes, and to sort of work in concert across the spectrum at all of these at once. So social tipping elements, some examples, removing fossil fuel subsidies. So you all know this, right? So the fossil fuel companies get massive subsidies to do what they do. They still get them, even as we know that they have to step back. So we need to bring pressure to bear that process, that behavior ends. Building carbon neutral communities, that's what I was referring to. So at the municipal level, so finding ways for people to be able to move around, achieve the things they need to do every day, buying groceries, etc., going to the library, doing those things without having to get in a car that is burning gas. Okay, divest funds from fossil fuel enterprises. Mentioned this last week, so Divest Oregon, a really energetic. This is a good example of a social tipping intervention, pushing on an element. We all know that when big funds divest from fossil fuel interests, it starves the beast, as it were, and makes it much more difficult for them to continue. So there's a very vibrant organization, that's working Treasury divest itself from all of its fossil fuel interests, and it was started by women here in the Portland area. Susan Palmater, and I can't remember her partner's name at the time. They began this key from other along these lines. This is a key element of climate action. Let's build the movement. The movement now is about 70 organizations strong, very well organized. They're pushing hard. The governor, the election for governor, particularly on the Democratic side. So Tobias Reed is a candidate for. He is the Treasury Secretary for the state of Oregon. He's been resistant. Tobias Reed is feeling the heat because of Divest Oregon. It's wonderful. So you can see, regardless of who we get, whether it's Tobias Reed or Tina Kotek on the Democratic side, there will be a commitment to divest. He's not going to be able to get the votes necessary to win the nomination without being clear about that. So it's a good example of the kind of energy that has to be brought to this and can work. Another thing is to make clear the moral implications, right, of continued fossil fuel use. We talked a bit about this last week and the week before about the intergenerational and international injustices of continued fossil fuel use. Those of you who weren't with us the first week, I use the example of driving to the grocery store. I use my bike most of the time, driving across the river. The carbon I pump into the atmosphere today is going to be here hundreds of years beyond my time. So when we think about intergenerational justice, we have to be thinking about the costs of what we do today, not just for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but our descendants long beyond us. And we have to be aware of that and begin to think about sort of the moral character of that sort of behavior and how we live our lives. Strengthening climate education. I'm convinced that there are some ways that we could advance the cause very well for ourselves if we increase education, particularly for young people. No offense, but climate education for kids. So one of the agendas that I hope to get our Metro Climate Action team to take up is pushing on at the state level to ensure that climate education is. I mentioned this to you last week. I was at a session with Tobias Reed a couple of weeks ago, and I was able to ask him. I said, "So, what do you think about a state mandate for climate education through grade 12?" And we had benchmarks, just like we have benchmarks for all the other disciplines. His response was dissatisfying beyond belief. He said, "Well, I like the way that teachers, they're already overburdened, and they obviously want to be paid more, but we can't afford to do that. So we really can't add a subject. But what we can do is have them integrated into the rest of their curriculum." Yeah, which is a non-answer, right? So it's clear that this is the kind of thing. Again, if you trigger this in young people, they're the ones who become most interested in securing a future because it's their future after all. So climate education is a nice example of a sort of strategic tipping element, something we can work Declaring the greenhouse gas costs of goods and services, labeling. There is a movement to do that in Oregon and in other states. I'm not sure how much I want that because it could be painful, right? But it's real. I mean, if we see it, then we can actually begin to measure what's the cost of buying this product as opposed to this product, using this kind of transportation as opposed to this kind of transportation. So you see it. So next one. So how do these work? At the personal level, using your social networks, right? To build support for the idea, for a belief, a behavior, a social norm, a social structure, technology, and using what we can refer to as citizen media outlets, right? LTEs, that's insider language, letters to the editor, that's all it means. Getting your letters to the editor, and it's surprising how often you can get a letter to the editor published if you write succinctly, and they eventually get to know you. They think, well, okay, we'll take another from Kugler. It's all right, but it should be more. People shouldn't see my name; they should be seeing all of our names, and it works. It's one of the things that this movement sees as a pretty powerful tool. So it's worth doing, right? Community level social tipping interventions, right? Joining with others to support, again, the list, the idea, belief, the behavior, the social norm, social structure, technology, right? To pressure policymakers, and that's key. I can push, right? I can send a letter to the editor decrying Kurt Schrader. By the way, purely an aside, so are we all still in Kurt Schrader's, right? Still in Kurt Schrader's district, right? Yeah. So I do door to door for the Democratic Party. I'm a neighborhood program leader. So I take cards and say, just make sure that's all. I go to Democrats and I'll go to Republicans, just go to the Democrats. And we only have Jamie McLeod Skinner on the card. It was very controversial. So the Democratic Party in 4 of the 5 counties decided they would not. It has to do with fossil fuel funds. He has taken $300,000 from fossil fuel companies in the last 8 years. That's astounding for a district where there's really no fossil fuel interests. So that's an example, politicizing it, but it's an example of how that kind of joint community action really can bring pressure to bear. So joining together with other folks in the various ways you can do it. So join Metro Climate Action Team or whatever it might be, and find those opportunities. Recently, I don't know if you saw there was an article, a column this week in the New York Times, but American as well, if I recall correctly. And actually, it must have been the Washington Post. That's the Oregonian takes Washington Post stuff, by Margaret Klein Solomon, who argues that, and again, she's a sociologist, she says, look at the data. Mass movements make a difference. And that's what we need right now. We need a mass movement that brings that kind of pressure to bear on public officials to actually take the actions, because they're not motivated right now. They don't see us in the streets doing what we need to be doing. So her argument is a mass movement. So we're joining together, doing this together. Somebody from Clackamas County. The funny thing is my phone never rings. I can carry it around all day and it does not. It really doesn't. Nobody uses. The only person who rings my phone is Hillary when she FaceTimes. Public policy level, SCIs, that's the goal, right? To get public policy enacted, to ensure that Joe Manchin actually says yes, and that we get some kind of change. So, but again, I think that really starts at the grassroots. So how do these work? Nope, sorry, next one. So ST, yep, there we go. Targets for an Oregon approach. Divestment I've already talked about. Divest Oregon is really great. So just go home, Google Divest Oregon, sign up for their emails. They'll send you alerts, and all you have to do is click on a few buttons to send a few emails, and it makes a difference. It's making a difference already. So they are a terrific group. Very well organized, and they will succeed. I promise you. It will be a couple of years, but they'll succeed. Climate education. Again, I said this before. I do think at the state level, pressuring the state to see to this. It's not that hard, and it's critical. And I say to my students at the college level who have been exposed to this stuff, they're engaged from the get-go. Students who have not been exposed. Matter of fact, one I had as a first semester freshman, I'm the name reader at graduation this weekend, and I saw Abby the other day in the hallway. I hadn't seen her for a couple semesters, and Abby came as a Sunrise Movement member, and she's risen to lead the movement at Lewis and Clark. She's the organizer. She's the Pied Piper, and she's got a career of activism ahead of her because she really believes in this. And it started with climate education when she was in middle school and in high school. So important stuff. We already talked about GHG labeling, communicating the moral implications. I just think that's stuff you do in conversation. Probably just as well that Mitzi's not here this evening. We had this conversation once in a while the other day. I don't remember what it was about, but she paused and said, sometimes you're too extreme. And I said, yeah, probably. Yeah, and you took the words because that's what I said. Conversation ended there, by the way. We just went and watched a Korean drama together. So, okay, next. So continue to track state level legislative efforts, right? We talked about this last week with the group that was with us last week. There are legislative efforts at the state level that have been successful. So, in the 2021 legislation, the 0 by 2040 in energy production was passed with Democrat support only, but it was passed and it has not been challenged in the courts, which is a bit of a surprise, nice surprise, pleasant surprise. The governor's executive order in 2020 that has sort of forced all of these agencies to come up with plans to ensure that we get to pretty ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. That's produced real work. They've produced good stuff, but now legislation has to pass to support that. So as the 2023 legislative session is on the horizon, it's really important for us to know what's going on, to pay attention. You can't rely on the Oregonian to do it for you. You can't rely on the Statesman Journal to do it for you. You do need to join some of these groups. You need to get on their mailing lists and get their emails. So Climate Solutions, Oregon Environmental Council, it's a list I gave last week. I'll send the slides, so whoever wants them, I keep saying I'm going to do that. I keep forgetting, but remind me. But yeah, it's getting on those lists is great because you know what's going on and you know what kind of legislation is being proposed, and you have good evaluation of the quality of that legislation, and you have very convenient ways to participate. They tell you, they'll send you an email and tell you, you live here, this is your congressperson, this is the telephone number, this is the email address, this is what you need. They'll write it for you. It all goes, it's like click a few buttons and you're on your way. Tracking the Oregon Environmental Council update. I showed that to you last week, I think, that sort of shows what's happening. It gives you an idea of what actually has been accomplished, what tracks going forward are useful. So again, something useful to do. Next thing, the other thing is at a personal level, just know what your own carbon footprint is, right? So go to any one of those calculators online. You didn't even need this list from you. Just go to Google, say, calculate my carbon footprint, and you'll get a bunch of online calculators that'll allow you to do it. Some good ones. There's an EPA calculator that's actually pretty good right now. I like the Nature Conservancy one because it asks tougher questions than some. and gives me a much bigger carbon footprint than I thought I had, but it's good. So yeah, these are all useful ways of sort of knowing how much greenhouse gas your own lifestyle is producing. Okay, and then rethink, reuse, and reduce. Find ways to do it. Just look for every opportunity, and you don't have to obsess about it, right? You just have to take every opportunity that comes to you when you think of it and use it. It's pretty simple, right? So bike commuting, food choices, home food production, exhausting your major purchases, using them up, right? Choosing the lowest carbon option in terms of life cycle analysis. Some of that's coming about. We were talking last week's session. The greenest car right now is still not an EV. It's the greenest car in terms of life cycle analysis is a hybrid, just because of the various costs that go into creating the car, its longevity, and so forth. So you just need to know some of those things. Reduce travel. Yes, we are going to Singapore. Sorry, go see our daughter. I got to do that. 360 energy efficiency commitment, which is sort of looking at your whole lifestyle and asking, how can I be more efficient in my use of energy, and just checking it, right? Checking everything. So turning the thermostat down to 68, or in our household, we live in this greenhouse that doesn't have any heating system. In our household, not turning on the space heater and telling Nancy, just put a sweater on. Okay. It doesn't always work either. Okay. All right, next one. So the elephant in the room. So last week we talked about the ways in which this is this famous formula. So our impact is a factor of population, the size of a population, the affluence of a population, and the greenhouse gas intensity of your activity. We can forget about intensity and population right now. We usually forget about affluence too. So we usually think the thing we could focus on is reducing our intensity. That is, reducing how many greenhouse gases we produce with our own activity. And we saw this last week. The reason most people would say you can't choose affluence is because there are plenty of countries in the world where people don't share the kind of affluence we have. And to say to them, you need to forego the movement from being a developing country to a developed country, such as we are, so that we all don't die on this planet, is kind of unfair, right? Because we've already achieved it. We're enjoying the fruits of that. So I always think, that really is the elephant in the room for all of us. And that is, what do we do with our own affluence? Because we are affluent, right? And this is technical stuff. I'm sorry, I should have changed this slide, but I told John, I have to confess, this has been a terrible week. And he texted me this afternoon and said, so I think you asked a question about having this on a data stick. And I thought, oh, well, I'm glad he reminded me that I need a data stick, because I need a reminder that I'm doing this tonight. So I looked at these slides really quickly and thought I should have changed this one. This is for a different audience. But so can we survive the slow death of neoliberalism? I don't want to explain all that. Yeah, I'm going to explain. So you see the definition. Neoliberalism, that's what we've lived with. That's what all of us have lived with for the last 50 years. That's the way our society and our economy has been structured. It's called neoliberalism. And it really is, it's not quite 50 years. So Thatcher, Reagan, that was the era in which neoliberalism really won. So policies of economic liberalization, that is free enterprise, truly free, right? That is allowed to go. Privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, reductions in government spending to increase the role of the private sector in economy and society. That's what characterizes so-called neoliberalism. And it's been a terrific economic engine, right? It's produced a lot of great fruits for those of us who live in an affluent part of the world. It has not produced a lot for people who live in parts of the world where affluence is absent. because you can sort of see when you think about that, what makes neoliberalism work is if you begin with capital, if you have something to work with in the first place. You don't have anything to work with in the first place, you can have as much economic liberalization as you want, privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, reductions in government spending. If you don't have capital to work with, you're not going anywhere. So the real question, I think, for us, and again, this is where it does, so this is this question of obligation or freedom or what. I think as people who have a kind of a different way of thinking of the capacity to think about the world in a different way, it gives us an opening to entertain the possibility that we can put aside some of our affluence for the sake of not just people on the other side of the planet, but for people we will never know, that is future generations. Because the ethical, when people talk about this as ethicists, I'm going to teach a course on religion and climate change next year. And one of the books I'll use with those students is this Ethics of Climate Change. And it's a great book. It's really readable. Byron Williston, if you ever want to read a really readable book on this topic. But he knows it is a chronic problem. It's very hard to convince people to act on the awareness that people living 3 or 4 or 5 generations beyond us will be affected by our actions. It's very difficult and so difficult that very rarely do people actually do it. And in fact, there is in ethics this whole business of discounting the future. So you actually do the math. How much benefit could you deliver to people in the present and the next generation? How much loss might that incur for generations 3, 4, 5, 6 generations down the line? And what are the chances we'll develop technological fixes for the things that we break before those people get to that stage? You see the math? But this approach would say, forget the math. Just assume for a moment that the people 5 generations down the line are going to be living with the same resources that we have. Do we want them to have less? Do we want them to have more? Do we want them to have worse? Do we want them to have better? And I think those are the kinds of questions we can ask that are easier for us to ask as people who live with this sort of long view of history that comes from being in the Christian tradition, because we know the past. We know there's a future. We know there's a present. We know there's a future. We understand that those things are shaped by ourselves, our shared activities, but they're also, as I say, at the end of the day, also in God's hands. So in the sense that if we make a mistake in the process, in the attempt, at least we'll have tried and we'll have been faithful to sort of our identity. So I think, as I say, it's the elephant in the room, but it's one that we should acknowledge and begin to think about. So let's go to the next slide and then we'll finish. So last word, how to stay sane and helpful. So personal action, make an inventory of your energy uses, determine where you can reduce most, do it, identify the more difficult things to achieve, choose one, work on it, and repeat, just kind of keep working, right? Community action, be really practical. Choose actions that have the largest impacts and are achievable. So I'll tell you again, divest Oregon. If you want to be a part of a winning project, they're going to succeed, but they can use every bit of help they get. They will succeed. It'll be great. There'll be a celebration. It'll be nice. The bills in the state legislature a little different. Got to be able to face some frustration. So the 2022 short session, there were a bunch of bills that, particularly the Metro Climate Action Team, felt strongly about. They just didn't go anywhere. So you got to be able to live with that. Share what you're doing with your social networks, the people you talk to. Don't be shy about it. You'll run into Mitzies who will say, "You're too serious about this." No, don't worry. She's on board. She's on board after all. She's the one who insisted on a passive house. And at the end of the day, never forget who you are and who God made you to be, because is. That will be the saving grace. All right, so I'll stop and you can, yeah. So I think I gave this to folks last week. Better Than the Ethics book. If you really want to know about climate change, Andrew Dressler's book, Introduction to Modern Climate Change. It's really readable, really easy, and a really great novel. The Mystery for the Future. I've plugged it a couple times. And the reason it's such a good novel is it's realistic. It is realistic. It pays attention to the science, and it imagines a future that is not hopeless. That actually is kind of hopeful, but based on a very scientific way of thinking about things. I think I said this last week. The scary thing about that book is it begins with the story of a killer heat wave in India, and thinks of that as happening maybe 20 or 30 years from now. If you've been watching the news, there's a killer heat wave going on in India right now. Not like this one, not quite this bad, but it wouldn't take much. So, all right. So you catch me, by the way, I should tell you, you catch me at the end of the day. I never teach classes after 4 o'clock in the afternoon because I can't do it anymore. So I did this, I survived. Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah, questions? Comments? Yeah. The slide, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, it certainly points to the fact that we need this education in the schools.
Yeah.
It's got to start.
Can you repeat the question to the Zoom?
Yeah, so the question was, or the comment was, it just points out the need for education in the schools. Yeah.
And see if there are questions.
Yeah, there are questions from you guys, I'm sorry. And could you hear any of this? And if somebody says, please repeat it all, sorry. Yeah, no questions. Yes, Sierra?
Yeah, so I guess my question was around like the Live Mass movement. Just thinking back to like 2020, there was like a very specific inciting incident for that. And I wonder what that looks like. Because we just had a massive heat last year. That did prompt a kind of climate response on a mass scale. And so I guess I'm just wondering what kinds of things could you see being like instigators for something like that? Or is it just kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know, yeah.
No,
There's also other things, like I know, like Occupy Wall Street didn't necessarily have like one specific instance. So there's precedent, but
Yeah. I mean, so the people who study this sort of thing say there's 2 ways this happens. One is an instigating incident, like the George Floyd incident, or in the novel, the killer heat wave that results in, and statistically entirely possible, 20 million people dying of heat exhaustion. That would be so that would be an instigating movement. The other way it happens is, and Occupy Wall Street in some ways is a good example of this, where there is sufficient numbers of folks. And again, it doesn't take 50%, it takes 25, maybe in this instance, people a percentage of folks who say this is a problem that has to be dealt with. And even though it is not presently causing the kind of catastrophic damage, death and destruction that a heat wave, for instance, might cause, or that kneeling on somebody's neck might cause. That can, when you get that sufficient mass of people. The thing about Occupy was it lasted for a while, and interestingly, it died pretty quickly. And part of that was because you didn't sort of have that sustaining threat, sustaining pressure. I think the reality now is we're going to get the harsh reality is we're going to get the sustaining pressure, the sustaining threat, and it's just and that's again with education. I think for youth is really important because they're the ones who really will do this. I think
we look at the climate events.
Yeah, what are the climate events? Yeah, we're going to get the climate. We're going to the climate events. We're going to get the gradual climate change. And again, that's part of it is knowing about it every day. I get the daily. Do you get the daily climate news? It's this aggregation of news from all around the world. Some days I just don't open it because I can't. I just can't read it. But it's this steady drumbeat of all the news, and when you start seeing the aggregation of it, that brings that really does have an effect. So there's kind of two groups I think that will constitute the mass movement if we don't get a precipitating incident, but it takes time. It's young people and older people. The Extinction Rebellion in Great Britain, almost even numbers of retirees and young people. So kind of interesting. An Extinction Rebellion is a radical group. These are people who lay down on the street, get arrested. They are protesters who are 60s style. So
Thank you, Rob.
yeah, Marie, sorry.
I keep thinking of that little girl that's been all around the world and still fighting for it.
Yeah, Greta Thunberg. Yeah, really interesting story on her this week too. She's because she got acquainted with activists from developing countries, in a particular young woman from Ghana, I think. She is now sort of changing her view of all of this as well. She's recognizing that even her view of this was a privileged Northern European. So it's an important adjustment. So yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yep, sure. See you guys.